Along with extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there are a variety of benefits that come with fall ESN application. Learn more at smartnitrogen.com.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. It is Tuesday, October 22nd, and that means it is time for Tuesdays with Lyndsey. So welcome here. Thank you so much for joining me. We've got a big show lined up for you today. It's a busy one. There is a lot of news happening. There are several announcements that have come across the news desk in the past couple days that we're going to catch you up on. There's some election results and some non-results that we'll touch on at the end of the show. We've also got, though, several policy things happening that we do want to touch on as well. So one of those that you'll hear just after the break is my conversation with Chris Vervaet. He's the executive director with the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association. And so that, of course, means working closely with the canola industry here in Canada. And there are some serious concerns about changes within the U.S., within the biofuel system, and within the incentive system within the U.S. There's some language in a particular law called 45Z underneath the Inflation Reduction Act that could potentially cause a lot of headaches for Canadian canola if feedstocks have to be completely domestic. There's a lot to unpack on this one, so I've got Chris to join me, and he's going to lay it all out as far as what Canada is potentially up against on this one and what sort of solutions there may be moving forward with the U.S. to ensure that Canadian canola is still a preferred feedstock for the biofuel industry in the U.S. So stick around for that one. We've also got a product spotlight today with Trevor Nysetvold with SGS. We're going to talk about seed testing this time of year and, of course, in the spring before we make our final decisions on seed lots. So we'll talk about that as well. And then I've got Colin Robertson on the show. And Colin is a former senior diplomat, and he's going to join me to talk about India. Now, this is, of course, an incredibly emotionally charged issue facing Canada right now. The Canadian-Indian diplomatic relationship is essentially in tatters. And there's a lot of discussions about what the RCMP has presented as evidence for the allegations made against the Indian government as far as interference goes and perhaps perpetrating murder and extortion here on Canadian soil. Ultimately, this is just a huge issue that perhaps diplomatically is a mess, but ultimately Canada and India trade very much in the agriculture space. So our pulses, grown largely in Saskatchewan, end up in India feeding many of the Indian people. And we are talking millions. And so this is an incredibly important aspect of the India-Canada relationship, realistically, and there is a lot at stake here for especially our pulse growers, but frankly just Canada and India as a whole. So we've got Colin to sort of unpack the history of some of this relationship as well as where we're at now and what it might take to repair this relationship between the two countries. So we've got that as well. And then, as promised, at the end of the show, we're going to touch on some news to cover. There's several things happening, some announcements as well about the global food ingredients plant that did lose its license and file for creditor protection. We do have some news from the Canadian Grain Commission on some payouts there for farmers who are owed money. So we'll cover that as well. So please stick around for that. Now, I did want to quickly, though, mention to everybody, you're invited to the Future of Fertilizer Tour. Learn about the proposed Genesis Fertilizers facility and learn about ownership opportunities, facility progress, and credible partners. The tour starts October 28th. Visit genesisfertilizers.com/future to register. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be back with more of RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM, right after this.
Get ready for tillage season with the high-speed disc from Brandt. Cut and size residue, create ideal seed beds, and level ruts faster than any other tillage machine. It's a better field finish and fewer passes, so you can stay on schedule, no matter what fall throws at you. And right now, you can get yours with a $12,000 rebate. There's never been a better time to bring your operation up to speed. Visit Brandt.ca for details.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio. I am Lyndsey Smith. Joining me now is Amy Crozier. She's the Senior Ag Specialties Rep for Nutrient, thinking about removal, but also think about nutrient uptake. So what our crop is going to need. How do we put those two things together when we're thinking about our purchasing decisions for the next year?
So it's very important to soil test. Know your geography. Are we short on water? Is our yield potential 30? Is our yield potential 50? Understanding what we're going for and aiming for. What's in our soil? Did we have disease issues? Did we have low proteins? Did we not meet our expectations? Is there nothing left in the tank when we're finishing off our crop? Did we have maturity issues? So all these different things put together can help influence those decisions. Maybe we want to change our strategy to have some season-long feeding products, depending on what our soil test tells us and what our crop is telling us when we're taking it off.
Where can farmers and their advisors go for more information?
You can go to our website, it's smartnitrogen.com.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on this Tuesday, October 22nd. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and this segment is brought to you by ESN. Along with extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there are a variety of benefits that come with fall ESN application. Learn more at smartnitrogen.com. I'm Lyndsey Smith with Real Agriculture and RealAg Radio, and joining me now is Chris Vervaet. He's the Executive Director of the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association. Who is COPA?
Yeah, thanks, Lyndsey. COPA, as you say, is the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association. We are the association in Canada that represents the interests of the crushing companies that do business here in Canada. We've been around for more than 3 decades. We work really closely with the Canola Council of Canada. So we are part of the canola family, and our linkage to the canola family is really through the good work that we do in collaboration with the value chain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I think for many of us, especially in Western Canada with canola, the good news story of the last few years has been the incredible amount of the expansion of the canola crush in Western Canada, of the actual infrastructure, either in place, planned, in the works, etc. Where does most of that crush go? So where does Canadian canola end up as far as oil or meal?
Yeah, for sure. Some exciting times for the industry with the expansion that is underway. I would say that most of the canola oil is still very much destined to the food market. That's our base. This is a market that we can not lose sight of and will not lose sight of. So the food market continues to dominate in terms of where the oil flows. A lot of the expansion, though, that is underway is predicated on what is not necessarily a new market, but we can call it a growing market, and that is biofuels. So a lot of the canola oil over the last couple of years has started to flow into the biofuel market. But I want to be clear that that is not taking any canola oil out of that traditional market. This is additional incremental demand as it relates to new flows of canola oil in the United States and here in Canada as well. Mm-hmm. The meal is a little bit easier to describe. It just gets used as a animal feed, and predominantly and mostly it's used as an animal feed for dairy rations because of its ability to increase milk productivity. So that's really where we try to target our meal sales to those dairy farms in the United States and other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Dairy cows love it. They make lots of milk on it. So it's a win-win. Everybody wins. All right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, but an important point, I think that we in this context, because we're going to talk about sort of some of those challenges for where canola oil or seed for crush ends up, specifically in the U.S. But yes, the focus is obviously food, but there has been, of course, in recent years, more of a push on the policy side for renewable fuels, for biofuel, for lower carbon intensity fuels, all of these words that people may hear or see in policy. And so one of the reasons we're talking today is there are, of course, things in the U.S. on the policy side, in the works that may potentially have an impact. We're not sure yet on that market for Canadian canola. So we're talking about 45Z. We're going to call it Z because we're Canadian, but I'm sure in the US they use Z. That's okay. We can celebrate our differences. So we'll start there, perhaps, of what is 45Z and why is the US sort of working towards this policy based on some of the factors that are happening with imports, exports, et cetera.
Sure. So 45Z is a provision that's part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which made quite a bit of news a couple of years ago in terms of putting that law into effect in the United States. And what it is, essentially, 45Z is a tax credit for biofuel producers in the United States. That's what it is at its highest level. Tax credits for biofuels in the United States are not new. There's been tax credits in that market for many, many years. But through those years, it's always been a blender's tax credit. 45Z is significant in that it changes from a blender's tax credit to a producer's tax credit. Another very significant difference between these tax credits when it migrates from a blender's tax credit to a producer's tax credit in 2025 is that the amount of the tax credit that a biofuel producer can earn is going to be contingent on the carbon intensity of the biofuel that they produce. And a big component of that carbon intensity is going to be the feedstock that they use. So feedstock refers to things like canola oil, soybean oil, corn, if you're talking about ethanol. These are feedstock, and they make up the big chunk of the carbon intensity that a biofuel producer generates from the fuels that they produce.
Okay. So, and just to be clear, we're moving from blender to processor as far as who gets this credit. And when we say, or producer, the biofuel producer, when we say the biofuel producer, we mean the company that's actually refining and creating the eventual biofuel?
That's correct.
Okay. Right, because we use producer to mean farmer, and so we should clarify that this is important.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I want to try and keep this clear because, of course, there are a lot of details to this that we're trying to sort of figure out. Now, why then the focus on the feedstock part? What other factors beyond, yes, we're looking at carbon intensity, but what has happened with imports, used cooking oil, et cetera, that has perhaps put this language into 45Z?
Yeah, so there's been a real dramatic shift in the types of feedstock that are being used in the United States. And this is largely driven by that concept of carbon intensity. The lower the carbon intensity your feedstock is, the more credits that a biofuel producer or manufacturer can earn. So everybody who is producing biofuels and is participating in these biofuel programs that incentivize lower carbon are on the hunt for the lowest carbon intensity feedstock they can get their hands on. And there are feedstock, for example, that are called waste feedstock. They have a very low carbon intensity score because they're deemed a waste. Some of these factors, like what it takes to grow a crop in terms of energy inputs, aren't accounted for as it relates to these waste feedstock. And a couple of examples of waste feedstock include cooking oil and tallow. So they have a very low carbon intensity, and they are being shipped into the United States at extraordinary volumes over the last couple of years. And just to paint a picture for what I mean by extraordinary volumes, just a couple of years ago, there was almost zero volume of imports of some of these waste feedstock into the United States from offshore origins. Right. You look at the numbers in 2023 and these offshore origins of imports, for waste feedstock has grown to more than 2 million metric tons. So from 0 to 2 million metric tons is really very significant in terms of the volumes that are coming into the United States.
Mm-hmm. First, it's hard to even wrap your head around what that might look like coming in. Now, from one perspective, that sounds kind of cool, right? We're using a quote unquote waste product and we're refining it into something usable. At the same time, as you mentioned, this isn't a domestic feedstock. This is somebody else's byproduct, another country's byproduct or waste that the U.S. is bringing in. And that to me sounds like where the U.S. and producers within the U.S. might not necessarily be super keen. So how has that impacted the discussion around where these feedstocks come from and what you can qualify for?
Yeah, I think you're really hitting the nail on the head with regards to where the concern is coming from. That number that I shared is, again, very significant, and it has displaced the demand for sustainable local feedstock like soybeans and canola that are grown in North America. So that's fundamentally where the concerns are coming from. And I should note that these concerns, while we see these volumes coming into the United States, the impact does actually spill into Canada as well. So a lot of the fuels, the finished fuels like renewable diesel that have come into Canada in the recent year, are also being derived from used cooking oil. So hundreds of thousands of tons of finished fuel is coming into Canada as well, with UCO, used cooking oil, as the feedstock. Right. So the way that we view this is, okay, the issue is certainly maybe more pronounced and obvious in the United States. It impacts the Canadian marketplace as well, and it impacts Canadian farmers as well. That demand displacement, again, is maybe more obvious in terms of what's happening in the States, but there's demand displacement happening for both soybeans and canola in the North American context for sure.
Right, when we think bigger picture. So again, from a canola oil or, if it's primarily going to food and going into cooking oil, and that cooking oil, when it's used, goes back into the refinery, that sounds to me like a pretty cool cycle. But it's the fact that, we're bringing in, or the U.S. is bringing in and displacing local, North American, other U.S., Canadian, with this offshore used cooking oil that's coming in. So that, I understand where that becomes a concern, certainly, as far as, the spirit perhaps of a policy versus what actually ends up happening becomes a discussion. What is the U.S. doing to potentially de-incentivize bringing in used cooking oil?
Yeah, so that gets to the crux of what we're talking about here as it relates to 45Z and some of the political dynamics that are underway. And maybe before I tuck into that particular aspect, again, I want to be clear that when we as a canola industry talk about imports or exports, we believe in open markets. That is something that is important to us. But we also really believe in a level playing field. So as these imports of waste feedstock come into North America, either again as a raw product or comes into Canada as a finished fuel, it's more about where are these feedstock coming from? What sort of traceability is in place to ensure that these feedstock are living up to the standards of these different biofuel programs? We have suspicions and we feel like there isn't actually a level playing field in terms of all of the tracking and tracing that is required for feedstock like soybean and canola oil isn't necessarily being applied or maybe even properly verified as it relates to some of the material coming offshore. So I just wanted to add that additional context to this story that's unfolding for us on things like used cooking oil or other waste feedstock. But at the end of the day, that's our concern. And what the U.S. stakeholders have been calling for is, and again, to really level this playing field to some extent, is for 45Z, this tax credit, to include a provision that only allows eligibility for feedstock that are domestically produced. Okay. So that is ultimately what the ask is of the industry as it relates to the provisions of 45Z. 45Z and the details of it and how it will be implemented are still under development. So this is still under construction, so to speak. And the ask from the U.S. industry is to include this domestic feedstock only provision.
So that initially sounds great, right? Solves the problem. But last time I checked, Canada, not the U.S. So as much as we are North American, as much as we are part of USMCA, CUSMA, whatever you want to call it, what we are trade partners, we are friends, we are all those wonderful things. Does that mean Canadian canola ends up as collateral damage?
Yeah, great question. So again, I think you said it quite rightly. We have a lot of shared concerns between our two markets. And we are highly integrated, and we've had a lot of success leveraging that integrated market between the Canada and the United States. But we are, of course, concerned with any blanket provision that might exclude Canadian feedstock from participating in 45Z. This is something that is very much top of mind and something that we are working as an industry to best address in terms of engagement with the Canadian government on some of these aspects that I just outlined. Again, it's complicated, right? There's different trade flows that might be unintended and creating some consequences as a result. So we are starting to have some of those conversations with our government, with our U.S. stakeholders as well.
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, 45Z under construction. So there's potentially provisions that could be allowed for in there. Barring that, though, let's say that, it's not necessarily fully addressed. Does something like an overarching North American deal like CUSMA, USMCA address something like this? Or could it, seeing as that is coming up? Or what would happen potentially if things aren't addressed in 45Z?
Yeah, I mean, we hope so, right? Again, it's that integrated market, whether it's through CUSMA or just that long-standing relationship that we have between our two countries. We are hopeful that we reach a point that some exemptions, for example, are granted for Canada. This is by no means without precedent as it relates to possible exemptions or carve-outs or whatever you want to call it as it relates to this domestic provision that might find its way into 45Z. In fact, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a monstrosity in terms of the amount of pages that one would need to read, but if you do read that kind of stuff like I do, you will find provisions in that act that already have specific provisions for U.S. trading partners. So, for example, that can mean CUSMA. So for some of the other provisions that they have in the IRA, for tax credits on different technologies or different sectors, there are existing carve-outs for partners like Canada. Mm-hmm. So there's a precedent there, and I think that would be a good outcome after all of this if there is a domestic provision that there is that carve-out for Canada.
Okay. All right, Chris, thank you so much for explaining this. It is complicated. As you mentioned, there are many facets to this, but we're trying to make sense of it all. And I do appreciate your time today here on the show. So thank you so much. Experience the most efficient system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to meet your crop's needs with Smart Nutrition, MAP plus MST. And we'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
Your co-op grow team are your local experts because we live here too. Our agronomic specialists stay up to date with the latest research and technology to help support your entire farm operation. Talk to our team for advice tailored to your farm's needs. We have recommendations to help you optimize your crop yield and quality while enhancing the health of your land. Co-op, we're all growing together. Here for your farm, here for your family. Learn more at coop.crs/farm.
Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Sean Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today.
There's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup to weed control, field trial results, and the latest yield strategies. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast in your favorite podcast app. Check out the latest Corn School episode today.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. I am Lyndsey Smith, and joining me now for today's Product Spotlight is Trevor Nysetvold, Senior Director of Crop Science North America for SGS. Trevor, welcome here.
Thanks, Lyndsey.
Now, it is, of course, as harvest wraps up, we start already thinking about next year. One of the key things we need to know before that seed goes in the ground is just how good that seed is. Tell me about the value of seed testing.
Right. Well, and that is the important point. We're preparing now for next year. We're also even determining the marketability of seed throughout the course of the winter months. So really, the value that we bring as seed testing labs is in our accreditation. So in order to conduct germination and purity testing in Canada, you have to be accredited by the Canadian government. You have to be accredited, your facility has to be accredited, but also your people have to be accredited. So there's examinations and audits and a whole process to certify a laboratory to do the work that we're doing. So really the value is in the expertise we can bring through that certification process and, the consistency and quality as well in determining those really, really important results for producers.
Now, in thinking about, from that perspective, the specific seed tests that producers may be interested in, which ones, I think there's many that are perhaps more common, but which ones would you say are the most important that farmers should be looking at when they're having seed testing done?
Of course, it is determined by the end use of the product, but for seed for planting purposes, we typically look at germination testing. We look at 1,000 seed weight, different disease tests, vigor tests from the standpoint of stress tests, and things like that. Those are the main ones. And the composition of the package you will choose will vary somewhat throughout the processing cycle. So what you would do on an uncleaned harvest sample will differ from what you would do on a clean processed product.
How might that be different? If I'm taking it, straight from at harvest, what might I be looking at then? And how might that differ, let's say, just before I'm making those final seed selections as far as seed lots go?
Right. Well, one of the things you're looking for is you're looking for the information to give you confidence to invest more money into that product, basically into cleaning and processing and different things. So it generally is a fairly basic package that we run on harvested material, which consists of a germination test, usually some form of disease testing to determine the presence or absence of different pathogens, and possibly a vigor testing. Of course, we're not doing 1,000 seed weight test on unclean product, because that determination is going to change dramatically upon cleaning.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Now, of course, this is one of those areas that's constantly evolving. What labs will offer as tests? What new tests might be available this year, or newer tests that farmers aren't maybe aware of?
Right. Well, speaking to our pedigreed seed growers, we are expanding our wheat midge refuge testing. We've added 9 new varieties now for that particular service. So we're very excited about that. We've put together some new packages that we think will cater more towards the needs of producers as they test just prior to seeding. So we've got what's called a cereal seeding classic package, which consists of 1,000 kernel weight, a germination, cool stress test, which is a form of vigor testing, and a Fusarium graminearum test, which is a disease test, specific to cereals. And all of that combined in a package for cost savings versus selecting each one of those independently. We've also got a package for pulse growers, which is the Pulse Seeding Classic package, and it consists of a germination test, 1,000 kernel weight, a cool stress test, and an ascochyta test, which again is another form of a version of disease test.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. So certainly something to keep in mind well ahead of the seeding season. I guess that is maybe where can farmers go for more information? But before that, what kind of deadlines are we talking? When would you encourage farmers, when we're thinking about those tests that would be specific to what they're going to put in the ground in 2025, when would you encourage them to get those seed lots in for testing?
We recommend a minimum of 2 rounds of testing throughout the winter months. One is just after harvest, so that's now, and producers are actively sending in samples now. And one is prior to seeding. So the harvested material coming into the lab now will take, it's upwards of 2 weeks for the longest duration test in those packages or those tests that I was speaking of. So it takes around 2 weeks for that, the full round of that testing to be completed. And it's a similar 2 weeks in the spring prior to seeding. So you want to give yourself enough time, not only to obtain the results, but also if the results should not meet your quality standards, you need to allow yourself the time to do something about it. Maybe source other product or things like that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Okay. And of course, Trevor, where can people go for more information about SGS labs and the tests that are offered?
Right. Well, we're available online at cropscience.sgs.ca. And we're also available toll-free at 1-800-952-5407.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, Trevor, have a great day. We'll talk to you again.
Thank you very much.
Okay. And we'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
If you only listen to RealAg Radio, you only get half the picture. For greater insight into the issues that affect farming, tune in to RealAgriculture.com. Crops, livestock, machinery, farm management and the markets, even food and travel. Real Agriculture Online digs deeper into the topics that affect the way you work and live. So get connected today. Read, watch, and listen to the people who know at RealAgriculture.com.
What were the issues in your fields this year? Did you do a soil sample? What is your soil sample telling you about some of the nutrient issues that you might be having going into next year? What herbicides did you use? What residues you might be concerned about? What weed issues did you have? What crop residues did you have? How well do you know your fields?
Get the answers to all the questions you have about your pulse crop at the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and this segment is brought to you by Alliance Seed. Introducing CDC NV CWRS with impressive yields, early maturing, outstanding standability, and a robust disease package. With CDC NV, your wheat crop will be the talk of the town. Learn more at allianceseed.com or call 1-877-279-2890. All right, we hop now to my conversation with Colin Robertson. He's a senior diplomat. He's also a podcast host, and he's got some excellent insight into Canada's relationship with India, frankly, how we got where we are, and if there is in fact a way to repair this rift with India. All right, I am Lyndsey Smith with Real Agriculture and RealAg Radio, and joining me now is Colin Robertson. He's a former diplomat and a senior advisor to the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and also host of the Global Exchange podcast. So welcome here, Colin.
Great to be with you, Lyndsey.
All right. So it's been a busy week, let's say, in Canadian politics. Not exactly a shining example of what we maybe would like to be happening in politics. Let's start on the India file. I feel like Canada is in a very tough position diplomatically, and also, of course, just trying to navigate how to deal with the India question. How do you feel, at least from this point, from your vantage point, how we are navigating this issue with India?
Well, I think, as you say, the government's in a tough position, but I think that the fundamentals are fairly clear. There is, I think, now clear evidence that Indian government authorities, up and to and perhaps including their most senior diplomatic representative, were involved in efforts to, at the end of the day, assassinate a Sikh Canadian and harass and pressure Canadians of Indian descent. We have ongoing with the Hogue inquiry, foreign interference in Canada, and we've of course been focusing mostly on what China might have done, but India appears to be right up there in using practices which are completely incompatible with diplomatic relations between particularly two democratic countries, and two democratic countries like Canada and India that have a long history. If you go back to India's origins as a country, Canada was instrumental in coming up with a formula that allowed India to become both a republic and then stay in the Commonwealth by recognizing the British, or Canadian monarch, as the head of the Commonwealth rather than as the monarch of independent Republican India. And then we were also one of the first suppliers of development assistance to the new republic, and Indian Canadians, of course, have migrated to Canada, working on our railways and making a significant contribution to Canada, one of our major source countries for immigrants, and particularly now for foreign students. India, I think, is at the top of the list there. So the people-to-people ties are very significant. The Indo-Canadian population is almost 5% of our population, people who can claim roots back to India. So that part of the relationship is pretty good. The trading relationship is something we've been constantly working to improve. We've been negotiating a closer comprehensive economic relationship since 2010. That's not gone the way we had hoped it would. And I think largely because we find at the end of the day, India tends to be protectionist, often around agriculture, but also around some of the manufacturing goods. But still, the trade has grown with India. In terms of the political relationship, as I say, it started off pretty well. We provided India with the technology through a Canada reactor, but then India broke what we thought were pretty ironclad guarantees and used the extracted from the Canada reactor to create its own nuclear weapon, which they exploded back in the 70s. And at that point, the relationship went into the doldrums. And then in the 80s, things got a bit tough again with the Air India explosion, which the Indian authorities have always been concerned about the activities of particularly those Sikh Canadians. And actually, the largest group of Sikhs outside of India are in Canada. They're members of and they're good citizens and members of our cabinet. In fact, I think under the Harper cabinet and the early Trudeau governments, there were more Sikhs in the Canadian cabinet than there were in the Indian cabinet, which just goes to underline the deep, again, people-to-people ties, particularly from the Punjab. But Indian authorities have been concerned for a long time about what they call separatist activities by those who want to see an independent Palestine. And they have pressed the Canadian authorities to take action. Successive high commissioners to Canada from India have spoken to me about this and said that we don't take this seriously enough. And some things seem to have gone beyond the pale. For example, at a parade in Surrey, there was one of the floats was basically extolling the assassins of Indira Gandhi, the former Indian prime minister. And the Indians felt that we were simply not taking this seriously enough. So I think that that's a piece of this, but that doesn't mitigate the fact that the Indian authorities, again, I think there's now clear evidence, have gone way beyond their remit by encouraging and efforts to try and contain this, which gone as far as they say, assassination of Sikh Canadians, including home robberies and extortion and things which simply just should not take place. And so the decision by the government to send home the Indian High Commissioner and 6 senior diplomats, in which India has responded in kind by sending 6 of our diplomats packing, I think that's it's unfortunate. The whole point of having diplomats is to try and solve problems. And so when you send your diplomats away, how are you going to solve the problems? And the India-Canada relationship is important, particularly to Canada. I think the Indians probably don't put the same weight on the relationship that we do with India, but they see themselves as kind of coming superpower. They're now the most populous country in the world, and certainly under Prime Minister Modi, they have achieved a level of significance, particularly given the changing in geopolitics and the strategic challenges between the United States and China, with India playing a critical role in, of course, the Indo-Pacific, which is now the theater where the United States really does want to put its emphasis on. But there are, of course, distractions like Ukraine and Gaza and now the wider Middle East.
Mm-hmm. So that I've heard it described in these few days since Monday's announcement. India has its sights on the U.S. Canada has had its sights on China. And so somewhere in this mix, there is this also very important trade relationship. And as you mentioned, people-to-people relationship between Canada and India that maybe has not been in focus, perhaps. We did have the announcement of the Indo-Pacific strategy announced in 2022. We've got, an office that's been set up there. Is that in jeopardy now, do you think? Have we potentially sort of shot ourselves in the foot, or is trade viewed sort of somewhat separately from the diplomatic relations?
Unfortunately not. I think the relationship, the political relationship, has become glacial, and that will have implications for the trading relationship. As you point out, the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was 5 years in the making, and it has basically 4 pillars. There's the China pillar, which is also glacial because the relationship with China, following the events with the 2 Michaels, has never really recovered, despite best efforts, especially given more recent allegations of Chinese political interference in our domestic elections. The second pillar, of course, with India, well, that's in the icebox too, ever since the Prime Minister Trudeau got up in the House of Commons earlier this year to accuse the Indian government of complicity in the assassination of the Sikh Canadian leader in Vancouver, Mr. Niger. And then the latest allegations about further involvement in various activities. So that's tough. We've got the relationship with ASEAN, and we have the relationship with North Asia, Korea, Japan, and to some degree Taiwan, which is moving along. But the 2 principal pillars, because they are the 2 biggest countries, is not going anywhere. And I think it's a reflection in no small part that I don't think China or India puts a lot of weight on the Canada relationship. We put much higher weight on the relationships with those 2 countries than they do with us. So I think they kind of figure they can treat us the way they want to, which is unfortunate because it has implications, as you point out, for our trading relationship. These are 2 countries with whom we have a trading relationship. We would like to broaden that trading relationship. And with the Indians, as I say, the challenge has been what we would see as Indian protectionism in a variety of facets, despite our best efforts to have a closer relationship. There is significant Canadian investment in India, but we have the investment protection agreement. We don't yet have the kind of larger comprehensive economic agreement that we would like. These negotiations started really going back to Paul Martin and under Prime Minister Stephen Harper and under Mr. Trudeau, but they haven't worked out.
On this India file, and I think, setting aside how many Canadians feel about Prime Minister Trudeau, realistically, the RCMP coming forward with the evidence that they have, I think that all of us can agree that when there is extortion, murder, we have a criminal justice system for a reason, and it should be upheld. That being said, and as you've related, we are decades of a complicated potentially relationship with, what happens on Canadian soil and the people that are here with ties back to India. Is there a path forward here that is clear as far as these governments being able to talk to each other, to work together to repair this relationship?
Well, Lyndsey, right now it's clear that we have major differences, and it's also clear that without having our principal diplomats in place, we're not going to make progress. And I always think it's highly unfortunate when governments withdraw, especially their ambassadors, because their ambassadors are the one individual who understand the country in which they are based and can provide intelligence and advice back to the Prime Minister. But if both of those individuals are not there, very hard for us to make progress. You end up having to do what we did a couple of weeks ago, where our National Security Advisor and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, I think, flew to Singapore to meet with Indian authorities to try and work this through in a classic diplomatic fashion. You do this quietly behind the scenes. The Indians chose to make it public, and so we then made it public as well. So there will be negotiations, efforts to negotiate. We have such deep people-to-people ties that it won't be that hard for us to find individuals who can speak to the governments. But for now, it's in some ways, it's quite unprecedented. It's one thing to have poor relations with a dictatorship like a China or a Russia, but with a fellow democracy and Commonwealth member, I haven't seen this. I can't think of a situation where I've seen it break down to this extent where we've thrown out the principal representatives on both sides. Although my read is that our current ambassador, Cameron McKay, is still there, that the Indians sent home our deputy high commissioner, who in fact had been reassigned to become our ambassador in Argentina, Stuart Wheeler.
All right, we're going to leave it there. If you'd like to hear more from Colin Robertson, head to RealAgriculture.com. We've got more of that discussion, plus a discussion on Bill 282 as well. Remember, the answer to your above-ground nitrogen loss problem is Anval Nitrogen Stabilizer from Koch Agronomic Services. To learn how Anval's dual-active ingredients deliver extended protection, visit kochag.ca. And we'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
Advanced canola trait technology is here. And it's soon to be the talk of the town. Optimum Glide delivers excellent yield potential and agronomic trait performance. Improved crop safety. Enhanced weed control. And a wider window of application. You're going to want to see this. Learn more at OptimumGlide.ca.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
Righto, friends, welcome back to RealAg Radio here on October 22nd. Yes, it is Tuesday. That means I'm your host, Lyndsey Smith, because it is Tuesdays with Lyndsey. And we've got a quick summary of some news stories that we are covering here with Real Agriculture. Of course, as always, you can head on over to RealAgriculture.com for all of these stories, as well as sometimes some audio to go with them. And a reminder, this segment brought to you by Pioneer Brand Canola with Optimum Glide, the highest yielding glyphosate-tolerant trait on the market. What's next in canola happens right here. Hopping first on the news that the Canadian Grain Commission has announced that those farmers owed by Global Food and Ingredients, they will receive about 75% of what they were owed. That is what the company had set up as a bond to cover its purchases. However, it does fall short. So GFI had $2 million in security available. However, there was a total amount owing to farmers of $2.661 million for unpaid deliveries. That was spread over 29 eligible claims. Now, the Canadian Grain Commission says checks are in the mail for those who had put in their claim, and that was validated. However, they're also leaving the door open that there is the possibility that the rest of the money that farmers are owed could be paid out if the proceeds of the sale of the company's grain inventory comes through and the receivership concludes, and then farmers may still see the rest of the money owed. However, at this point, the bond only covered about 75% of what farmers were owed. This, of course, is one of 4 different companies that went into receivership or lost their licenses, the CGC license this year, owing farmers money. And so one of these has been resolved. This one is mostly resolved. We're still waiting for news of a few others as well. So certainly remember, when any of this happens, and we covered this quite a bit earlier this year when these companies had their licenses revoked, farmers do have a chance to put in a claim for what is owed. However, you only have 90 days. So it's really important when these revoking of licenses, et cetera, happen, that farmers are really on the ball and make sure they get their claim in so that they can be considered in the payout should one occur. Perhaps on to some better news. If you are interested in learning more about soil health, leadership, networking, the whole bit, the Ontario Soil Network has opened up applications for its 2025 Soil Network Challenge. Now, personally speaking, my partner and I were part of the 2021 cohort. This is a really cool way for farmers to get together, learn about leadership, about speaking, about extension work, and frankly, learn about soil health. Imagine that. All part of the Soil Network Challenge. And so for those interested, applications are open, and the selected participants will be informed in early January. This is a 6-week course with 5 virtual sessions and 1 in-person gathering that will take place in early 2025. So it is a bit of a time commitment, but I promise you it is well worth it. So there you go. For what it's worth, check that out. That is the Ontario Soil Network. Head on over to their website for more details. On the provincial election front, a lot of things happening. So we did tell you about BC heading to the polls on Saturday. As suspected, it was too close to call. So the incumbent, David Eby, is in essentially a dead heat with the Conservatives led by John Rustad. Now, it is so close that it will take potentially 4 or 5 more days to officially declare a winner, we hope. Now, we did also have a New Brunswick election yesterday. That one was decided. One day, all done, and we now have a new premier of New Brunswick, the first female premier of New Brunswick. Her name is Susan Holt. She is a Liberal. The Progressive Conservative leader, Blaine Higgs, did concede defeat. He didn't even win his seat. That's how unpopular he was. So there you are. New Brunswick has a new premier, a Liberal premier, the NDP in a dead heat with the Conservatives in BC. And guess what? Saskatchewan goes to the polls next week. So, we'll be keeping tabs on all that and what it may mean or not mean for the federal government, of course, as we go forward. Definitely today, following along with the news, plenty of calls still for Trudeau to step down, but we are still waiting. As of recording, anyway, we still hadn't heard whether or not the MPs that were calling for Trudeau to either step down or change direction, whether or not that letter had been presented, with as many as 20 to 30 MPs signing off. Still haven't heard as of yet. We'll keep you posted. All right. That does it for me for today. I will be back on the issues panel on Friday. As always, if you've got feedback on today's show, you can zip me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com. I've heard from a few of you sharing some of your wins of this season, some of the challenges you're still facing. I appreciate all of them. So thank you very much. You can, of course, follow us across social media. We are at Real Agriculture. We are on Twitter. We are on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and always at realagriculture.com. You can find all of our coverage there as well. Have a wonderful Tuesday. Enjoy the week. We'll talk to you again on Friday. Cheers.